So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here for the event Fast Fair Forever, Why the World Needs a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm Sebla from the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, Head of Africa Campaigns and Advocacy. And I'm joined today by a group of incredible panelists. And maybe when I call your name, you can just wave so everybody knows who you are. We have Patrick Rondeau from the Fédération des Travailleurs et Travailleuses du Québec. Great. We have Disha Ravi from Fridays for Future India MAPA. We have Jerry McEvely from Friends of the Earth Ireland. Augusto Duran Duran from the Movimiento Ciudadano Frente al Cambio Climático from Peru. Lorraine Chiponda from Don't Gas Africa and the Africa Movement Building Space. And Brianna Fruin from Pacific Climate Warriors. So these voices from every continent on Earth are urging for and demanding a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to enable a just transition from the weapons of mass destruction of coal, oil, and gas, and a just energy transition to renewable energy for all. So we're here at COP now, and we're seeing the absolute slugfest that it's been to get the phase out of fossil fuels into the negotiations text, despite fossil fuels being the lead cause of the climate crisis. And this is happening while countries are on track to produce 110% more fossil fuels between now and 2030 than what can be burned to limit warming to 1.5 degrees at a maximum. And this is happening because there's currently no international mechanism to actually manage a fair wind down of fossil fuel production. There is a massive omission in the Paris Agreement in that the leading cause of the climate crisis, fossil fuels, is not mentioned once. How is it possible that we're trying to address a crisis and we do not go to the root or the source to address this? This is why we're calling for a fossil fuel treaty as a complementary international mechanism to complement the Paris Agreement that calls for no new fossil fuel expansion, a fair phase out of coal, oil, and gas with the richest countries most responsible for the crisis leading the way, and a just energy transition to renewable energy for all, an economic diversification and alternative development pathways that comes with finance and technology transfers. This proposal is now supported by 12, I believe, or about to be 12 nation states calling for a fossil fuel treaty, for hundreds of parliamentarians in over 80 countries, thousands of scientists and academics, 100 cities and subnational governments, 101 Nobel laureates, and more than 2,000 organizations around the world, including the WHO and the European Parliament. Every day we're moving closer to making this fossil fuel treaty a reality, and we're looking to have a block of first mover countries that can actually get a negotiating mandate. And you are all part of making this possible, so I want now to invite our different speakers to share how they've been part of this movement. And we're going to start with Patrick Rondeau, who is the Union Director of Environment and Just Transition for the Fédération des Travailleurs et Travailleuses du Québec since 2019. Patrick was the FTQ Regional Advisor for the Greater Metropolitan Area from 2012 to 2019, where he worked on climate issues, support for mobilization, and socioeconomic development. He's been a member of several committees on the energy transition and the circular economy, and he currently represents Union College on the Government of Canada's Sustainable Development Advisory Board. He's also coordinated several union delegations to COP and is currently the co-focal point for the UNFCCC trade union constituency. So, Patrick, we'll start with you. Can you please tell us why it is so important for an energy transition to be worker-led?
Yeah, thank you very much. And maybe, first of all, just to say that my organization is a very proud signatories of the treaty, and was the first labor federation to sign the treaty, so we're very proud of that. So exciting. Well, I'd like to begin my remarks with a question, as a matter of fact. Will the transition to net zero emissions be something that happens to workers and communities, or would it be something that happens to them and by them? For trade unions, we know that there's only one answer possible. to this question. Building a fully net zero economy in 3 short decades is going to take a huge amount of work. Hundreds of millions of workers will be tasked with physically building and operating this new economy. Millions of communities around the world will host it, and billions of citizens will participate in it. There's presently, right now, more than 30 million workers operating directly in fossil fuels, not mentioning people depending on those jobs. More than 50 countries completely depend on fossil fuels for more than 85% of their energy needs, which is huge. Furthermore, 40 countries are heavily fossil fuel dependent economies. It is estimated that these countries will lose more than 60% in oil rents alone during the period 2040, under a net zero 2050 global decarbonization scenario compared to a business as usual scenario reflecting stated policies. So, in order to save the planet, we need a new social contract. Trade unions demand a well-managed, just transition away from fossil fuels, a real fossil fuel phase-out, with employment guarantees. We need comprehensive just transition policies with a focus on the labor dimension. Decarbonization of fossil fuels industries is currently becoming a greenwashing operation because of carbon offsetting. However, if we want to get out of this scheme, we must address the situation of value chains and small and medium-sized enterprises that do not have the means to make this transition yet. Moreover, without the active participation of workers, these plans would only meet resistance. Therefore, that is why the fossil fuels phase-out must be well managed and include those who will directly suffer the impacts. So that is why we need a just transition work program at this COP that puts labor issues at the center. Just transition plans should be co-created with workers and their trade unions under social dialogue to provide and guarantee decent work, social protection, training opportunities, and job security for all workers affected by the global warming and climate change policies. But let's be clear. We're not saying that the just transition should not involve other stakeholders, far from it, but without workers, it will not happen. The new economy we need cannot be a business as usual. Of course, the transition to renewable energy is desired, but will not solve the fact that we still do not respect planet boundaries. That is why the design of the new economy, the creation of new jobs, and the implementation of new public policies must include gender, intergenerational equity, and the recognition of indigenous rights and other rights as well. In this overheating world, there is no more time left for delay. There's more than 200 million workers around the world, and every one of them is depending on a lot of outcomes, and including this COP28. That means, once again, a well-managed just transition from fossil fuel phase-out is much more needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you so much. I think it was really powerful saying, is this transition going to happen to workers or be created by workers? And I wanted to follow up with another question about how the Fossil Fuel Treaty can support workers who want to be sure that the energy transition is equitable and fair.
I kind of answered that question in the opening remarks, but the Fossil Fuel Treaty, the reason why my federation joined the treaty is that one of the 3 pillars of the treaty is that just transition issue. And once again, you know, workers are people. We often forget about that. And if the only transition for them is job losses, they won't be part of it. So we have to design those just transition plans so that they can participate, be mobilized under those very well-designed plans and be part of this big umbrella, which is social justice and climate justice. For us, we all want just transitions to be fair, equitable, and so on. And we totally agree with that. But the just transition concept under the International Labour Organization on 4 pillars, which is social protection, social dialogue, decent work, and and labor rights, including equity issues and policies, is a very specific place where workers and the trade unions can be part of this fight against climate change under this climate justice umbrella. So that is why it's so important for us to be included and at the center of the specific issues, and at the same time be part of a collective effort, like the very important work that the treaty is doing. And I will conclude by saying my federation was the first one to sign the treaty, and I do hope that others will follow. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I think it's incredibly important what you've said about the importance of also not, if the only transition is job losses, you don't want it. And so we know that there's a much higher potential of job creation with renewable energy, but this won't happen by accident. It has to be designed. So thank you for laying that out to us. And now we're going to go to Disha. Disha Ravi is a climate and human rights activist who co-founded Fridays for Future India in 2019. She was named as the climate change agent in the Forbes Women Power List in 2021 and as one of the 9 Indian climate warriors paving the path for a more sustainable tomorrow by Vote India. Disha became an activist after seeing her family impacted by the water crisis. She advocates for better environmental and climate policies and governance. She's been at the forefront of demanding protection for environmental defenders and activists across the world. Disha is a writer passionate about making sure the voices of MAPA, the most affected people and areas, are heard in climate conversations. So welcome, Disha. My first question to you is that there seems to be growing support, or there is growing support and organizing around a fossil fuel treaty within the youth movement. Can you tell us more about this and why youth are leading on the key treaty demands?
So firstly, wait, can you hear me? Okay. So firstly, thank you for having me. And I think it took us decades to even get here for fossil fuels to be center stage in conversations and negotiations. And despite all of this, countries around the world are still approving new coal, oil, and gas projects. And the science has been clear. IPCC reports have said that we cannot continue to have new coal and gas and any fossil fuel projects if we are to stay below 1.5, but it is continuously ignored. And even despite being center stage, the word fossil fuels, the F word, as I like to call it, or coal or gas, they're still shy to use these words in conversations and negotiations. And this is costing us time that we do not have. And the youth movement recognizes the desperate need for a treaty that prioritizes a just, fast, fair, and equitable transition away from fossil fuels. And it's really, really important to implement that. And that those just so happens to be the demands of the treaty. And I think one thing that's really interesting in the treaty is that it recognizes that responsibility is to be divided equitably, and you can't assume the same responsibility of global north countries and global south countries. And it recognizes historical emissions and how colonization played a huge role in where we are today. And that is something the youth movement has been saying and has stood behind. And this is what makes us really support the treaty, because we need a we need a process to essentially fast track our phasing out of fossil fuels.
Thank you, Disha. And I think it's important to highlight that contradiction or that hypocrisy that you've mentioned about how long it's taken to just drag fossil fuel center stage, and this hypocrisy between how much this COP has been flooded by fossil fuel lobbyists on the one hand with their hyper-presence, and then their invisibility in a lot of the final text that we see coming out. Next, I wanted to ask you more broadly why it's so important to have young people and youth being engaged in international processes like the COP.
I think one of the main reasons we are here is to track negotiations and also influence them. We could do this online, of course, but it is important to be here in person just so that we can work together with other organizations and civil society movements from different regions in person to influence decisions, and more importantly, to put pressure on governments and authorities to ensure that they are staying on track and they're sticking to climate action that surrounds the principle of climate justice. Because there is a lot of climate action that can be taken that doesn't actually follow the principles of climate justice. And these are very dangerous distractions for us to be in. And us being here is a reminder that the climate crisis is not a future event. It is already happening. Millions of people in the global south, in countries like my own in India, are already suffering the impacts of the climate crisis. And these people are the most marginalized communities who've contributed little to nothing to the climate crisis, but they are the ones who suffer the most. These people are considered disposable by world leaders, and our presence here is a reminder that we will not be silenced and that we are here and we're not disposable.
Thank you, Disha. Thank you so much. And now we're going to move to Jerry from Friends of the Earth Ireland, who is head of policy. Jerry leads their policy and advocacy team, which supports their campaigns on fossil fuel phase-out, energy poverty, and climate action. The organization's efforts have resulted in major campaign wins against fossil fuel infrastructure and major policy developments in support of climate action renewables in Ireland. He has over 15 years' experience of developing and influencing policy in the government and not-for-profit sectors in Ireland and at the EU level. So if you could break down for us, Jerry, what are some of the key gaps in current climate leadership within international processes?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you very much for having me. As was just said, I am with Friends of the Earth Ireland, and briefly a little bit of context. So Ireland is not a major fossil fuel exporter. It has relatively progressive climate policies, I have to say. It has strong renewables commitments. So what's not to like? Why am I here? Why did they let me in? And I think there is a lot to like there. But I think Ireland, and I'm going to bring it back to the Irish context, but I think many of the points I'm going to make will be relevant to your own or applicable to your own. But it's one of the countries most at risk of fossil fuel lock-in. And that's why Friends of the Earth has consistently put its weight behind a Getting Off Gas campaign. And on Friday, more than 60 Irish civil society organisations called on the Irish government to sign the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And in answering your question, I'm going to base it around 3 gaps or 3 assumptions, and I'm mainly going to apply these to gas, to fossil methane gas. You're not allowed to call it natural gas, but I think they're also particularly relevant to perhaps oil and coal use in your country as well. So the first gap, or the first misunderstanding, is that gas isn't a transitional fuel. You're no longer allowed to let anyone say, use that phrase. And we basically, because we don't have a transition if we're still building permanent infrastructure. It's a fundamental contradiction in terms. And this is quite relevant in the Irish case, but where gas infrastructure is still being proposed, where more gas plants are still being built. And crucially, and I'm surprised this doesn't come up more often, there's no plans for decommissioning when new infrastructure is built, when it is regarded as necessary. And that should really be fundamental. If it is regarded as necessary for a particular reason, where is your decommissioning plan to ensure it aligns with our climate obligations? And also, in terms of new infrastructure, we still have new oil and gas boilers going into people's homes. All of this infrastructure is going to be with us for decades to come. And we have, and just briefly touching on this issue of boilers or heating, we have to remember that it's often the poorest that have the least ability to buy that insulation or to buy those heat pumps or to buy those solar panels to move off that fossil fuel heating. So there's a major equity element here as well. That was the first gap. The second gap is around energy security. I'm not going to give you a lecture on energy security, thank God, but there is a deliberate attempt to conflate gas security or fossil fuel security with electricity security. What do I mean by that? So, of course, the two are linked. You know, for example, gas security of supply and electricity security of supply. But more fossil fuels isn't necessarily going to help with the flow of electrons to your homes. Having good electricity infrastructure, good energy efficiency in your homes is going to help with security for you. So the point I'm making is that fossil fuel infrastructure is often justified or attempted to be justified on energy security grounds, and I think that really needs to be pushed back on by our governments. And secondly, in terms of this energy security issue, more gas or more fossil fuels isn't the same as security. You often see this in the media where there's questions around security, and the first question they ask is, well, are they building that pipeline? What's the situation with those fossil fuels coming in? But I'm not going to go into detail here, but there's obvious gaps here. For example, you can build an LNG terminal. That doesn't mean the LNG shipment is going to arrive when you need it. So again, there's a need to challenge these assumptions. And thirdly, and I am continuously shocked at how this isn't brought up more often, but we have to be clear that more indigenous, bountiful renewables and energy efficiency, shock horror, also provide energy security. So, and I don't want to sound like I'm living in a dreamland here. I know there are issues around, for example, wind variability, but we need to be clear. We're entering a world where, for example, solar, its growth is exponential. So, and where battery storage is rapidly increasing. So the basic point here is that renewables are an answer to our energy security. That was the second gap, or the second assumption around energy security. The third one, and this is a definite gap, is around the need for clear and equitable legal obligations. And I often think, you know, the worst outcomes in the policy world start with really bad assumptions. And at the moment, I think we have a bad assumption with us, and it's deliberately peddled by the fossil fuel industry, that if we simply build more renewables and more storage, for example, then the end of the fossil fuel era will magically arrive. And I hope you don't misinterpret me here. I'm not simply trying to say that we need renewables and we need fossil fuel phase out. All of you already know that already. What I'm talking about here is that the legal frameworks are not in place to ensure that fair and equitable phase out of fossil fuels while we develop those renewables. And that's why we're talking about that at the COP now. And I'm sure many of you have already heard that, you know, ongoing fossil fuel extraction and expansion are not compatible with the 1.5 degree limit. But what hasn't been addressed, and actually this is just in analysis released by the IEA today, that pledges based only on renewables and energy efficiency and some methane reduction only bridge about 30% of the gap in reaching our in 2030 towards reaching our climate goals. So for those reasons, that is why we have this focus, and it's what the treaty is obviously attempting to do, but this focus on delivering an orderly and just decline of global fossil fuel use. And for all of those reasons, we want Ireland to support the development of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and I know that afterwards Lorraine will probably touch on more the myth around gas as a transition fuel, but thank you so much for kind of exposing all these myths to us, and also that renewable energy expansion alone is not enough. It needs to be coupled with constrained supply and phase out of fossil fuels. And I think you transitioned really well to the next question we wanted to ask, is how might a government endorsement of the fossil fuel treaty complement the goals of the Paris Agreement? And I also wanted to add the campaign that you're working on now for a fossil fuel treaty in Ireland, if you could share anything about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. So maybe just to start with the first question on how might a government endorsement of the treaty complement the goals of the Paris Agreement, I was thinking that when talking about the Paris Agreement, first of all, it's quite intimidating talking to a room about referring to the Paris Agreement because half of you could have been involved with writing it, but, or influencing on it. But I'm sure many of you already know that the centrepiece of the Paris Agreement is based around ratcheting and the need to produce progressively enhanced pledges or climate plans. But you probably already know this, it doesn't specifically address fossil fuels. And that's also why we're having the negotiations now in terms of the energy package and the need for this clear text on a clear and equitable fossil fuel phase out. But it's not the case that when we're talking about the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's simply a case of an obligation, that we simply need an obligation to phase out fossil fuels, and that is put into a legal agreement. We need specific and clear legal obligations so that governments have to deliver policies that clearly set out plans to prevent production, phase out existing extraction, and put in place a just transition. And countries ultimately need to point, ideally having supported the treaty, but flowing from that, point to their own national laws and policies which show fossil fuel use declining, or how they're going to ensure fossil fuels decline. And I can provide, and that's all fairly high level, I can provide an example of this in the Irish context. So in the Irish context, Ireland has it has a progressive climate law. It has to produce annual climate action plans. Those plans are supposed to deliver carbon budgets, or ensure we meet our own national carbon budgets. But what is not clearly set out in those climate action plans are targets and plans for reducing fossil fuel production and use. We have perhaps one side of the equation, but we don't have the other. And on a progressive note, I think Ireland has, at least the Irish government has taken note of this, and in a recent energy security policy has noted the need for planned reductions in gas demand, and noted the fact that renewables do provide energy security. So that's relatively progressive. And then to answer the second part of your question around the campaign in Ireland, I actually hesitated there because I'm so much into the detail that I have to try and stand back and set out some information for you on the Irish campaign. I mean, basically, Ireland's in a stronger position because it's got, for example, a very strong relationship with small islands, developing states. It's already made commitments to, for example, prevent new fossil fuel exploration licenses. So our campaign so far has been very much directed at the government to point out that it is strategic for them to support the treaty, number one, and secondly, it's focused on, at this stage, trying to get a really broad network of organisations to support the call for the treaty, including those who are perhaps not normally engaged in this climate and energy space. And we've plans to get more endorsements by other politicians, and ultimately, I think, to perhaps even broaden it out into the public space, and even with celebrities, and go more so in that direction in 2024. The COP has naturally provided a real focal point, and that's why we're still hopeful that we can push for some type of an announcement from Ireland hopefully in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry, and I hope that can also be inspiration for all of you if you want to start or keep running your campaigns where you're located. Now we're going to go to Augusto. So Augusto is a mechanical engineer from the Universidad Nacional de Ingeniería. He has oriented his work towards the use and development of renewable energies as a strategy to face the climate crisis and to guarantee energy sovereignty in Peru. He's a specialist in clean energy and energy transition, and currently regional coordinator of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty in MOSIC. So, yo te pregunto en español. This will be in Spanish. Okay. Durante la cumbre por el Clima, el secretario
Throughout the Summit of the Climate, the Secretary General of the ONU and 9 indigenous organizations joined from the Non-Proliferation of Fossil Fuel.
como tal puede
How can a treaty be to support local indigenous groups, can push for action for the climate and the end to fossil fuel expansion in their territories?
Bien, buenas tardes con todas y todos. Reciban un caluroso.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please have a warm welcome from the Peruvian government, South America, a territory that is always resisting against extraction and fossil combustion and the advancement of climate change and what it has for Latin America. In this sense, right now, in high-level conversations, politics conversation, in closed spaces, we have a debate about what is transition and what can transition be as such. But this debate has technical aspects, especially from the needs to see energy as a mechanism that creates this economic space as such. But right now, we are critically avoiding the human rights subjects and the ecosystem subjects that are necessary to debate in a transition. That's why we see the opportunity that can be opening for the call and initiative to co-construct a non-proliferation treaty. Because for our territory in Latin America, the 3 pillars that are proposed by the treaty are very significant. What do I mean by that? I won't talk about global terms because I think most of you know it, but I should leave some message and key messages that can help us to know the context of Latin America. Right now, we have a strong forest coverage of the Amazon that are one of the main pillars in the fight against climate change that right now is being threatened by several industries, especially extractive such as deforestation, palm oil, extensive agriculture. But we need to highlight the fossil fuel as such. Around 10% of the Amazon territory in the Amazon is overlapped with petrol and oil lots that are creating an impact on the Amazon. We should remember that the Amazon is a reserve of biodiversity and it has a lot of culture and originary peoples that have been there for millennia, and they defend bravely this territory. So we have already an impact of this as product of the fossil fuel and the activity of oil. We can talk as well of the Equatorian case in which most the half of the Amazonian territories is already overlapped with oil lots that are already violating rights in the territory, such as in the case of Peru, Colombia, Bolivia. A third of their Amazon territories as such, it's overlapping with oil concessions, and this can send us to look for a mechanism that allows to put the defenders of the environment, indigenous communities, indigenous peoples, and social organizations, and give them a shield, a defense mechanism, because as such, the Paris Agreement has not been enough, and it's not enough. We talk about emissions, but they don't answer the dynamics of the territories from the south, from Latin America, that have been for years a territory of conquerors and also raw materials for the north. So I hope from this, our friends that are listening right now from north, it's not just about creating a transition as you do a transition in the north, but to start to look at us and start to question what does it mean for the South in this transition. Because we should call it a fair transition, and it should be fair because the transition in the North should not implicate and result in colonization in the South. We should leave the fossil fuels under the ground, and the countries from the north should be forced to start with the process of transition. But this should not create a process of colonization of the south. The new minerals, such as lithium, for this transition are a key subject that we need to talk about it and debate it here in this non-proliferation treaty, because this is part of the third pillar when we talk about fair transition. So we believe, and that's why all the indigenous nationalities in which we work together and we create a process. And I also want to mention the idea of Patrick, because a treaty of this size requires a process in an open scale, talk with syndicates, civil society, indigenous peoples, to co-build and to have a treaty that could answer to the different dynamics of the different territories.
Muchas gracias. Súper poderoso todo lo.
Thank you. So it was very powerful what you said from the territories are resisting and not to create the same dynamics of colonization in the transition, and the importance as well of the support from the bases. The second question that I wanted to ask is about the backup of Colombia the last week because of this treaty, and also with the indigenous nationalities that you mentioned of Peru and the Amazon.
Liderazgo climático en la región.
What can we say about the leadership in the region? Well, as I said in my first intervention,
América Latina, Sudamérica,
Latin America and South America has an important role in the transition processes, because we have the capability and the potential to make this transition. We have several resources, but this shouldn't make us blind and start exploding. We should see mechanisms
correctos
that should be correct and also careful to respect the limits and the physical limits of the planet. So we should stop thinking about an infinite growth with a finite planet, because we have our resources with a season and a deadline. So in this case, the leadership in Latin America is interesting because the impacts that the fossil fuel industry has led, such as oil in our territory, has opened some demands that have been worked throughout years. So we won't invent powder, and we won't copy the work that we have not done for years. Indigenous peoples, the local communities, the fisheries have been resisting, and in this process they have brought demands that can support in the co-construction process of this non-proliferation treaty. I've tried my best to simplify several of them, and I take the advantage to make this, present this to the floor so we can see from the south. We have some proposals that you can analyze and bring to the table. And something that is very obvious and is connected to the first two pillars of the non-proliferation treaty is the new exploration and exploitation of fossil fuel, specifically in the Amazon and in the mining and coastal areas of America. Why? Because we should stop the concession and new lots of hydrocarbons in the Amazon and in the close coastal areas. That means also that the banks from the north should stop investing in these territories. Something that is important as well, to give new alternatives and economical ways, because several times we say in South America is that we cannot leave extractivism behind fossil fuel or another, because this is what brings development. From whom, we don't know. But the idea should be to look for economic alternatives, such as, for example, the indigenous economic that has bring already results. In the Peruvian case, we have a perverse logic from the state and government that allows the dependence in an unhealthy way for the extractivism, such as hospitals, transport, schools, depends of the extractivism, especially oil. So we should find economic alternatives to the extraction of fossil fuels that could answer at the same time of the dynamics of destruction areas. This is an important point. That would be my first point. Stop the exploration in the Amazon and the coastal areas. Another important thing is that the states, all of them, should start the processes of energetic transition. And as I said before, with caution and responsibility. And also the big consumers, such as the South areas and the big companies as well. So we can stop creating an impact on the South, stop exploiting fuel. But with this energetic transition, should it be enough with fairness? It also should be popular. And what do I mean by saying popular? As Patrick was saying as well, in a broad stage in which usually in the South we never ask to the people living there, and we don't have a council about how this should be done. Laws are done in small, closed areas. They talk in the parliament between ministers about what is happening right now. And that's why they do not answer to the proposal and dynamics of the territories. That's why we believe that this treaty should answer to this, and that's why we bet on it. The states should establish clear politics with participation to remediate and restore the ecosystems, especially with oil activity. And this is an important point, that sometimes the ones that will not live in the areas in which the fossil fuel is extracted cannot understand it. But right now we are talking, for example, and the governments talk about energetic transition, but what does it mean with energetic transition? First of all, to remedy all the areas in which we had impacts from fossil fuel. In the Peruvian case, since the 97 until now, we have more than 1,000 oil spillage in the coastal areas and in the Amazon. We cannot think about a fair transition if we don't remedy this and create an alternative and a way out for these ecosystems and the population that depends on it. One last thing, and to close up, and I'm sorry because I took so much time, but the state should guarantee the collective rights and individual rights of indigenous peoples, especially in the Amazon and communities in the coast. This is very important because when we talk about transition and we're trying to look for new energy sources, should be done in a responsible way. If we don't give the titling of the territory for the ones that have already preserved it for millennia, it should be only coming back and again to the same model, to stop using fossil fuel, but we will use another energy transition with a brutal way with the impacts that will arrive to the territories. This should guarantee as well new models of energetic generation. We should not think only that the energy should be created by a company and sell to us, and we should buy it. Why we cannot start thinking of new models, such as corporations created by communities, municipality companies that could face this model that we have, or has already led us to this crisis. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Augusto.
Thank you, Augusto.
De la transición.
The importance of transition that should be fair and popular, and that the Amazon is not on sale.
Mito de que la
And we should leave this myth that fossil energy is development. And now we will talk about this question with Lorraine in the African context.
I'm going to switch over to you now. Lorraine has been in the climate justice space for nearly a decade, having engaged as an activist, as a community rights defender, a regional climate and energy facilitator, and now embarks on a role under the Africa Movement Building Space as the Africa facilitator, and is also the co-convener of the Don't Gas Africa campaign. And Lorraine works with a broad spectrum of African civil society organizations and groups, creating a collaborative space that facilitates collaboration along the intersections of different African movements. So this is a bit building off of the response that Augusto was giving before around fossil fuels as the essential, necessary pathway to development. So They're normally positioned this way or frequently positioned this way in political spaces and in the media, including also, as Jerry had shared before, the framing of gas as a transition fuel. So can you actually break this down for us, how this is really a fossil-fueled fallacy?
Thank you very much, Seble, and to all the speakers that came before me. So I'm going to zero in on the dash for gas in Africa, given that, it is the threat that we're faced with currently. So prior to the global energy crisis that was fueled by the Russia-Ukraine invasion, we saw a number of countries from Europe especially looking to replace their energy reserves, particularly fossil fuel corporations that came into Africa to extract gas and to export it to Europe for European consumption. So to us as African people, we saw this as a fossil fuel companies crisis. I know a lot of CSOs have articulated on this, but it was a crisis by fossil corporations who want to perpetuate a similar system of extraction and especially affecting African people. So when our own African governments picked up on this, they then started a narrative where they saw gas as a transition fuel and felt that Africa can have an opportunity to develop from gas. However, from what we are experiencing now as a result of that dash for gas in Africa, it is showing us that the expansion of gas in African countries undermines almost every element of development. And I'm going to touch on the different aspects of development that we have been lied to by our own African governments. What we have seen in Africa is, and even our own African governments, is that the fossil fuel industry has misappropriated the language of climate justice in order to legitimize the huge and massive expansion of gas in Africa. It is a fact that Africa lives in energy poverty. It is a fact that we don't have access to clean cooking. And this has been misappropriated by fossil corporations who are now pushing for gas in Africa. But we all know that the gas is not to alleviate the energy poverty. The gas is not meant to, benefit any sector of our economy, and it is rather extractive. If I talk about the case, I'm going to talk about the case studies and examples of countries that in the past 2 years have actually been expanding on gas. I'll start with Senegal. If you look at what has been happening in Senegal, when Shell, started exploring gas in Senegal, most of these new projects in Africa are happening in coastal areas. So that means in South Africa, we're seeing a lot of, exploration in the ocean. In Mozambique is the same thing. In Senegal is the same thing. In Mauritania is the same thing. And along these coastal areas, there are fishermen who for decades, for centuries have depended on fishing livelihoods to supplement their income, and to feed their household. So again, when fossil corporations come into these areas, in the coastal areas, they've displaced fisherfolk, they've displaced communities and people that have been depending on the same coastal areas to attain a livelihood. So again, it gets me back to the fact that gas is undermining every aspect of Africa's development, including affecting our alternative livelihood systems that we have depended on. It is a fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, around 60 to 80% of the people depend on land-based livelihoods, depend on our alternative livelihood systems, and are not necessarily feeding into the mainstream economy. So we have to preserve these alternative economies and also alternative livelihoods. I will not get into how it is affecting our water systems, because you can imagine a gas project happening in coastal areas, what that does to the quality of fish, right, to the water systems itself. So this has been a system of excluding Africans from attaining a source of living, excluding Africans from accessing our coastal areas and even our indigenous lands as well. Again, the dash for gas in Africa and the same fossil fuel energy system sees gas and energy as a commodity, right? So once gas is seen as a commodity, it means that the ordinary person, the poorer person, cannot access the energy. It is then sent off to richer markets who can afford to pay the fossil corporations the energy. That's why we still have the rampant energy poverty in Africa. And the gas, if you look at the pipelines, how they are structured, all the pipelines are leading out of Africa. There's no pipeline that is leading in Africa. Even some of the landlocked countries that have got gas are actually now constructing pipelines that burrow through communal lands, that burrow through communities' households, so to get to the shore for export. So gas is not for Africa. The agenda to invest in gas has seen from whereby we had 4 countries that had gas in Africa, and now we've got more than 12 countries that have started exploring gas in Africa. And this has been a short-sighted strategy by our African leaders and corporations, even backed by European governments, right, who feel that Africa could potentially profit off of the selling of gas. But we all know what the export of raw materials has meant for Africa. Africa for decades and centuries, even from the time we were colonized, has been seen as a hub for extracting raw materials. And extracting and exporting cheap commodities will not bring any profit or income to African governments and will not feed into our economic systems. So again, Africa is still being seen as Europe's fuel station. And I'm saying this because it is the reality of what is happening on the ground. And we are still seeing the rampant energy poverty. So gas is actually a fallacy. Our African leaders are misguided to adopt gas or any other fossil fuel as a transition fuel. I would urge each one of us, if we have time, to go to YouTube and see a video that has been produced by Don Gas Africa called Shifting Power. It really narrates some of the stories from across Africa of communities that have been affected by gas. Again, I would urge us to go and look at YouTube. There's another video, the Ororo Inferno, a community in Nigeria that has been produced by HOMEF, which shows how our oceans are burning up. And now fossil corporations that have mined from decades ago are not providing a remedy to communities. Some of them have since left those wells that are burning now and have left them to local business people. And it is foolish for African business people to take up these projects that have been dumped by large corporations and try and make profit out of it, because they are being left with social, environmental impacts that need to be remedied. And now more and more African communities are now beginning to demand for justice and organizing and, taking away the social license of such corporations. So indeed, gas is a fallacy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lorraine. That was incredibly powerful, and there were so many connections between how the fossil fuel industry operates in different corners of the globe, talking about sacrifice zones in the same way that Augusto did about the sacrifice zones in the Amazon. And a lot of these connections were also very international, with what you were saying about how much Russia's invasion of Ukraine drove this scramble, European scramble for African gas. So given all these international connections as well, how do you think that a fossil fuel treaty could support governments who want to invest in alternative economies or alternative development that isn't reliant on fossil fuels?
Thank you for your question. So in order to protect people, our environment, our ecosystems from the impacts of the fossil industry, the treaty provides an opportunity for our African governments to protect its people from the impacts of the fossil industry by negotiating a better transition away from fossil fuels. The treaty gives power and leverage to our own African governments, and therefore I would push our own governments to join the bloc of nations and other countries that are signing on to the fossil industry. Our own governments have never benefited from, one, the global finance architecture, from the energy system itself. So again, the treaty provides a space and principles that allow for equity, that allow for transformative relationships. And the treaty also facilitates a transformation of our energy systems with a transformation of our relationship with our energy systems, whereby our energy systems protect our environment, are compatible with our food systems, are compatible with our water and our oceans, and are compatible with the rights of indigenous people and people that live in communities that are hosting some of our very precious ecosystems. What Africa needs at this point, if I should add, are decentralized systems, are energy systems for the people. And the treaty can actually be used to negotiate for that. And when we join as a collective of different countries that are rallying around, that are marginalized or that are poorer, it gives us more leverage than trying to compete in a fossil system that does not benefit us and never will. Again, the treaty is a mechanism for building climate resilience. Africa has contributed very little to the crisis, and we now need to effectively build resilience of communities so that we are able to adapt to the climate crisis, and the treaty facilitates and enables that. And again, I'll get into the issue of skills development. This is what Africa needs to transition. And the treaty is better able to negotiate for skills development so that we are able also to tap into renewable energy and provide energy for the people. It is able even to transform trade relationships between the global north and the global south. So I believe that the treaty is able to do that, transform trade relationships, transform even the global finance architecture so that it allows countries to transition in a safe manner, in a transformative manner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. And I think all of those points you added around skills development, around transforming trade relationships, and having decentralized energy systems are all helpful in adding more elements to the pillars that can eventually become the foundational text for a fossil fuel treaty. So last but not least, we have Brianna Fruin, who is a Samoan climate activist who has been leading community grassroots projects pushing for climate justice for most of her life. At 11, she became a founding member of 350 Samoa, becoming the youngest 350.org country coordinator. And today, she is a proud Pacific climate warrior fighting for the survival of her islands. So at this COP, we saw Samoa endorse the treaty. Can you tell us more about this critical role of Pacific nations in showing leadership on the fossil fuel treaty in international spaces like the COP?
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you all to my fellow speakers. It's so great to go last because there is much that my comrades have already said that I no longer have to echo, so thank you for that. But what I can do is teach you a little something. It's the second week of COP. I know it's almost 6 p.m. So to get a little bit more energy into the room, I'll teach you what we call a mili and a pati. So when I say mili, you rub your hands together. So, mili, 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 mili. And then when I say pati, you clap. Mili, 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 patia, patia, patia. So good. Okay. The second part of that, I'm going to say lua pati, and that's 2 claps. Okay? And then to end it off, I'll say hey, hey, and you say ho. I see 2 Samoans in the crowd, so come on, lead us from that way. Okay, so one last time, let's go. Mili, 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 mili. Patia, patia, lua pati, hey, hey. Oh! Thank you so much. Now that, my friends and my colleagues, is the Pacific way. I don't know if you've seen any Pacific people around COP, but we are very loud. Some of us are walking around with speakers in our conference bags, playing our own music, wearing very loud colors, and laughing very loud. And the reason why we are loud is because we fear if you cannot hear us, you will forget us. And we've been forgotten many times at many COPs. And almost worse than being forgotten, our climate leadership for so long has been co-opted. I remember being at COP28, and there was a debate about whether they would have 2 degrees or 1.5. And I don't know if any of you were in Paris, but I have a vivid memory of the wallpapers that the French presidency had put up together with the UNFCCC that had 2 degrees everywhere. They had 2 degrees as an ambition target everywhere. And we knew as Pacific Islanders that there was no survival for us at 2 degrees. We knew that it had to be 1.5 to stay alive, and we fought for that. We fought for that. There was a young group of people from the Marshall Islands called Jojikam. Them, together with the government of Marshall Islands, started a campaign called 1.5 to stay alive. And that was controversial at the time. I remember having to ask permission from my funders that took me to COP21 if I was allowed to post a picture with 1.5. And then I remember last year at COP where the UNFCCC were giving out 1.5 badges. And so that's a little example of the fight that our indigenous people have had to put into this process. And the reason why I mention that is because now with Pacific Islands signing the treaty, with Samoa coming on this week and signing the treaty, it's a step onto that legacy. It's part of that legacy. And that's why we believe in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, because we know that as fossil fuel industry hacks at the ground, as they gas the ground, and I'm so grateful to hear the indigenous voices here today. We're talking about the land that's being degraded for the fossil fuel industry. As far as I'm concerned, as they dig into these coal mines, they're digging out land from our islands. That is a direct impact into our islands. And so that's why we know that there has to be an immediate stop to this industry. And so I'm very proud that my country stood strong and decided to support the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I also acknowledge the leadership that came before that, so that they could stand and do that alongside other Pacific Island countries that were some of the first to stand up and endorse the treaty.
Thank you. So I have one more question for you, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you have them, just keep them in mind, and we'll get to you. I wanted to ask you, so we started this COP with 8 country endorsements for the Fossil Fuel Treaty, and now we're at 11. So I want to ask you how you think this latest endorsement from Samoa will contribute to the momentum of the Fossil Fuel Treaty in the region, but also globally.
Absolutely. I think that's the key word, right? Momentum. If we look at the treaty as a canoe, we're Voyager people from the islands. We have a deep history of indigenous voyaging. And so if you imagine the treaty as a canoe with many empty seats, some of the first voyagers to step into this canoe were Pacific Islanders. Now we have more voyagers. We have Colombia. We have Palau. We have Samoa, who are new voyagers within this waka. They're stepping in. Absolutely. But there's still empty seats. But it is great to celebrate the new voyagers that are stepping in, because as they paddle, we go faster. And we go together. But I think what we can also learn from voyaging history of my people is that we didn't voyage in single canoes. We voyaged in fleets. We cannot put all our eggs in one basket. We need to have the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, VACA. We need to have the VACA of the loss and damage voyages. We need to have the VACA of the people who are working tirelessly within those negotiation rooms and holding the line for the text that we hope to get. So I think that the momentum we need is to get more voyagers, is to get more people on board. And I am proud of the new ones that have come into this VACA, and I hope that we get more, because there's many empty seats that need to be filled.
Thank you so much, and it reminds me of the quote, I think it's Miriam Kaba, that says, everything worthwhile is done together. So thank you so much for leading on this collective work. Now we are going to open questions to all of you. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand. Nathan and Ziona have microphones. They'll pass to you, and you can maybe say the person that you want to direct your question to. Anna? Okay.
Yes, hi, Larry with Rise for Climate Belgium. My question is for Patrick. Even if the transition can be done in the fairest way for workers, under the best conditions, with support, career guidance, retraining, nobody wants to lose their job in mid-career, have to start all over, learn new skills. There's an expression in French, I'm sure you're familiar with, fin du mois, or fin du monde. So if you have to worry about getting to the end of the month, you're not going to worry about the end of the planet. So how can you really convince oil and gas workers to accept, to turn their backs on their employer, who would love to just keep paying them to continue their work and to move on and take part in the transition?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's a very good question that we have to face most every day. For the trade unions, it's been so long that we've been speaking about just transition. We're very, very happy to see those developed under principle by the ILO around 2015, because it gives us a means to engage with workers, our members, people. And the first thing is about dialogue. You know, if we refuse to talk to them by fear of their reaction, then nothing will happen. If we don't engage with them, then they're going to lose most probably their job at some point. So the first thing to do is about engaging with them, dialogue, and we really talk about social dialogue, you know, in a tripartite way with the employers, states, but the starting point is start with our own members, with people. And then the first thing that we do when we talk to them is asking them, what is global warming? What is greenhouse emission? And most of them understand the effects but cannot explain the mechanics of it. And they don't make the link between human activity, work, and global warming. And when we do that, first of all, they freak out because they say, oh, it's my job and I'm going to lose my job. And then we say, okay, but you have a choice. Do you want to be spectator of what's going to happen to you? Or do you want to be actor of what's going to happen to you? And if you want to be actor, we're going to build collectively an action around just transition for you to be at the table when decisions are taken. And this way to engage with them works. In the Quebec Federation of Labor is a federation of independent unions. We have 30 unions under our umbrella, and each and one of them has now just transition policies, plan, and know what they're going with that. And that's the way to do it. And you know, there's a story around the fight against climate change. We have to mitigate at the most, reduce at the source. If not, we have to adapt, and then you have lost and damage. It's a very linear narrative, and so the whole planification just transition is in the mitigation. And then, of course, we're trying real hard to bargain for social protection, you know, for those who could and will lose their job all the time. But as long as they are part of this, they're mobilizing.
I'm Ana. I'm a journalist from Brazil. I have two questions. The first one is, what do you expect from the Brazilian government for the presidency of COP28? We are here at the COP28 where we didn't expect to have fossil fuel at the center of the debate, and it's happening. So I wonder now if Brazil is joining the OPEC Plus and planning to invest in new sources of oil. What can you expect from this presidency? And the second question is, if and how do you engage with the finance sector? Shouldn't be the banks and investors also signing this treaty?
Thank you, Anna. And who do you want the first and second questions? Anyone? Okay. All right. Who wants to take those? You can respond to different ones, but who wants to start? Or have a think? Okay.
August is going to answer because Brazil is closer to Peru, so I'm going to answer. In fact, the issue of Brazil is a climatic leader, and we have high hopes for Brazil in these negotiations, especially because it's one of the biggest economies right now in Latin America. We, however, believe, and this is an issue that we can debate, that Brazil still
empernando,
insists
allanando
on
activismo como tal.
Extractiveness. They have one of the biggest oil companies, and to stop that dependence can bring very different problems to their economy. So, what does the treaty proposes? A progressive fade out. Of course, we need to talk about deforestation as well, because Brazil is a very important leader in this aspect. But in case of fossil fuels itself, it has a great responsibility. But we believe, for example, that nations like Colombia, that economically they're not at Brazil's level, can also give a step forward, a first step forward, and show how this process should look like, urgent, step by step, and we should think about how can we fade out of fossil fuels, how can we decouple the economy from carbon. We start from coal, sorry. We need to debate the system that has been imposed on us on the global south. We have resources, we have richness for everyone in this country to have a fair life. What doesn't exist is a correct redistribution of it. So part of how we start to fade out of this extractivist economic model is to see new ways of development. And I think these debates with different voices of this distribution are very important. So we think that civil society as such, communities and people need to pressure, because unfortunately we know that the countries are not open, or are not always open to stop the fossil fuels. We would love to have 100 petros in Latin America, but we do not have them. So we have a historic role and a commitment, and we have been colonized for 500 years. So we know that we need to push those decision makers to forget about fossil fuels. Thank you so much, Augusto.
Heard your expectations around COP30 and also what you think the role of finance should be. Those are the two separate questions. Does anyone, you want to go?
Maybe I'll just touch on the role of finance. We have got a lot of expectations for COP28, and the simple one is, of course, the phase out of fossil fuels, not leaving any mechanism to allow any entry of fossil fuels or dangerous distractions such as carbon markets. And then the role of finance. The first thing around finance is to decolonize finance. We've seen how the global finance architecture, global financial institutions, multilateral development banks, how they've disenfranchised Africa and poorer nations, how they've resulted in first administering policies that don't work for Africa, and they've resulted in accumulation of debt, and they've destroyed our social safety net as a result of privatization that has been pushed by, I don't know if I'm allowed to name institutions, but by the World Bank. So we need to decolonize the finance architecture. We need to make sure that it speaks to what is needed for the growth of poorer nations, of African nations as well. So I think, yes, finance has a role to play, but it also has to transition. All forms, all the pillars that are holding the transition need to also transition, including finance, including governance, including issues with democracy, participation. So that again needs to be transformed effectively. And we are hoping that this COP will usher in discussions around that as well.
Thank you, Lorraine. Did any of you want to add, or should we go to another question?
Can I come in just really briefly? I feel like I should just add the little bit I know on this, and perhaps some of the treaty colleagues can come in, but that question around, is it possible for financial institutions to sign? I'm aware that Dutch-based Triodos Bank has become the first bank to join the global campaign for a proposed fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So it is possible. And then just another point worth bearing in mind, I would generally, when I think of the risks, I would naturally think of, well, what fossil fuel companies are resident in Ireland, or what extraction projects could potentially take place in Ireland, or what infrastructure could take place in Ireland. But we absolutely have to consider the financial institutions as well. And there was a research by CAN Europe and Friends of the Earth Europe that noted at least 107 out of 425 of the world's biggest fossil fuel extraction projects are operated by EU-based companies or financed by major European banks. So it absolutely is another part of this challenge, absolutely.
Thank you so much. The next, okay, go ahead.
Hi, I am Marsa from Nepal, and for me, people are already suffering from the impacts of climate change, because even though when the temperature rises just 1.5 for the rest, for Nepal, the Himalayas, it's already plus 1.5. So we are, even that much is not safe for us. And to add on to this, we are mostly dependent on fossil fuel import, and that happens to be the highest imported commodity in our economies. And we have set the targets for 2045 net zero, but then there are the targets are set they are conditional targets. So the funding arrangements around that happens to be the most important thing that we get. And for a landlocked country that is dependent on solo import of fossil fuels, how will this treaty address the issues?
Is there someone in particular you want to address the question to? Okay, who wants to take the question? Okay, should I take the question? So I think that it's important to highlight how much the treaty is grounded in proposals for global justice and equity. So that means that the richest countries of the world that have driven this crisis, so to name names, the US and Canada, the UK, Norway, Australia, countries like this that have significant fossil fuel production and also much more diversified economies, also need to be providing, they're the ones that need to shut down their production first and fastest, but also need to be providing finance and technology transfers for countries to transition to renewable energy. So it's not going to be on Nepal to lead this transition, that it's in a mess that it did not cause. The countries that are most dependent on fossil fuel production, for example, should be receiving, and that's key pillars, that's in the fair phase-out pillar, there needs to be finance and there needs to be open technology transfers. There can even be proposals around debt cancellation, because there's countries like Ecuador that have oil debts to countries like China. They're obligated to extraction. So there's proposals around actually having different forms of, like Lorraine was saying, financial architecture to also unlock free countries from these dependencies, and then have economic diversification and renewable energy expansion, so countries like Nepal are not hyper-dependent on fossil fuel imports for their economy. Does anyone want to add anything, or should we see if there's more questions? Okay, are there any questions in the audience left? Yes.
Hi, thanks everyone for your comments tonight. It's Chris Wilkie with Waterkeeper Alliance, and I don't know who I'm directing this to, perhaps the woman from Samoa, and I'm sorry I didn't get your name, but I'm thinking about the process of negotiations right now, because you mentioned that, and the final text that will hopefully come out on the last day of the COP. And then alternatively, we have the fossil fuel treaty being negotiated. But I understand there's 80 countries that are very high ambition that are pushing for a strong inclusion of fossil fuel phase out in the final text. Is there any discussion about what those countries may do if they don't get what they want? Is there like a dissenting faction that might produce their own statement? Or are they all going to join the fossil fuel treaty call? I'm just wondering what happens if we don't get what we want, and of course we do still want to get what we want. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. I can try my best to answer this. I think for 28 COPs, we haven't gotten what we want. And the work still has to continue. I think that's why we need something like the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. And I shared this at another treaty event as well, but I've learned from a friend of mine that in the climate space, we often call the fight against the fossil fuel industry David versus Goliath feat, when actually we should look at it like Gulliver's Travel, that there's just one giant and we all need to be throwing ropes over. And the UNFCCC system is just one of those ropes. And another rope, and a strong rope, is the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so what I know my Pacific Islands do, if we don't get the text that we want, is that we leverage our other ropes. We have to start work on the Loss and Damage Fund and what that looks like. That is a big feat for us in the Pacific Islands. We are the least financed region in the world. We receive less than 2% of global climate financing, and even I think it's like 0.3 of that actually gets disseminated into the islands. So that's a big job for us to do. So I think after this COP, if we don't get the text we need, we still know that there's so much work to do. And then we have to prepare for next year's COP as well. And then the COP after that, which might be hosted by Australia, that would be a big COP for us because it's been posed as an Australia and Pacific COP. And what exactly does a Pacific and Australia COP mean if Pacific Islanders have to pay for visas to get into Australia? You know? So, you know, this is one fight, but there's so many fights that come after that.
Yeah, I think I totally agree, and we must not see each COP as a finality by themselves. You know, it's a whole process which takes too much time and go very too slowly, but it's a process. And you know, 3 years ago, it would have been totally impossible to talk about fossil fuels and decisions. And then just to have the framing phasing out was quite impossible 1 year ago. And now that those options are about phasing out. So I think we're getting somewhere. We have to keep on the pressure. And maybe the biggest difference that we have is that we're working together. We're working on cross-constituency level, trade unions, NGOs, EN NGOs, environmental NGOs, indigenous, women and gender, youth. We're working together on that. And we're putting the pressure, and we keep on pushing for what we want. And if there's a good sign of that we can see is that the way that OPEC is panicking right now, I think is a good indication that we're going the right way.
Okay, thank you so much, everyone. We don't have any more time for questions, but I'm going to try and highlight some of the takeaways that I heard from all of you. We heard from Patrick around the importance of workers to be at the center of the energy transition, that an energy transition cannot happen to workers, it must be by workers, and that labor issues need to be at the center of the just transition and have this process be co-created by workers, because if the only transition is job losses, it will not happen, and we don't want it. We heard from Disha on the decades that it's taken for fossil fuels to come center stage, being dragged literally as the main causes of the climate crisis, that each country or regions have very different responsibilities in causing this crisis, and so therefore we need to address the realities of climate colonialism. We heard from Jerry around myths of gas as a transition fuel, that they come with absolutely no kind of binding plans on decommissioning this infrastructure. The myth around more fossil fuels equaling climate security or energy security, and that renewable energy expansion on its own is not enough. We need to phase out plans. Let's see. We heard from Augusto about the territories in resistance, that the Amazon is not for sale and that we need to resist the recent examples we've seen, for example, in Brazil, of the oil licitation blocks happening in the Amazon, And we need to also concentrate on the transition, not only in terms of technical terms, but also in the rights of people, collective territories, and human rights. We heard from Lorraine about the complexity, the geopolitics of this transition, how much Europe's energy crisis meant eyeing Africa as a new continent for gas exploration and locking in the continent potentially to decades more of fossil fuel infrastructure, and the harms this has also caused to traditional livelihoods and fishing, the dispossession and displacement from traditional territories, and exposing some of these areas by the fossil fuel industry as sacrifice zones. And then we heard from Brianna that there is no survival possible at 2 degrees, and that the Pacific countries have shown their leadership championing 1.5 to stay alive and are doing the same now with the call for the fossil fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that we need everyone to do this voyage. We need everyone doing this collectively. And then from the conversations and questions from the audience, we heard how much the climate crisis is already here now. It's not a future topic. And that's why the Fossil Fuel Treaty is concentrating on constraining the supply of fossil fuel production that's currently on path to produce 110% more fossil fuels than we can burn if we want to limit warming to 1.5, and actually have an equitable phase out for countries most dependent on fossil fuels for their economies and their energy supply and their employment, and ensuring there's a just transition with alternative development pathways and economic diversification and renewable energy expansion. So I know a lot of you are already part of this movement, but those who are not, we invite you to join us and that we collectively push for the Fossil Fuel Treaty together. Thank you. Oh, and I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers. And we have a bunch of documents on the Fossil Fuel Treaty here if you want to grab any. Thank you.